President Bola Tinubu has directed the opening of Nigeria's land and air borders with the Republic of Niger and the lifting of other sanctions against the country with immediate effect. A statement issued by Special Advisor to the President, Ajuri Ngelale, said the directive is in compliance with the decisions of the ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government at its extraordinary summit on February 24 in Abuja. ECOWAS leaders had agreed to lift economic sanctions against the Republic of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea. President Tinubu also directed the lifting of suspension on all commercial and financial transactions between Nigeria and Niger, as well as the freezing of all service transactions, including utility services and electricity to Niger Republic. Other areas affected by the presidential directive include the defreezing of assets of the Republic of Niger in ECOWAS Central Bank, as well as assets of the Republic of Niger, state enterprises, and parastatals in commercial banks. Suspension of Niger from all financial assistance and transactions with all financial institutions, particularly EBID and BOAD, travel bans on government officials and their family members. President Tinubu has also approved the lifting of financial and economic sanctions against the Republic of Guinea. Joining us now on the morning show as we look at the pros and cons of this new development is Professor Efem Ubi, Acting Director of Research and Studies at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. Good morning, Professor Ubi, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Dr. Ruben Abati. Thank you for having me.
Okay, Professor Ubi, very quickly, what are the pros and cons, as I said earlier, of this decision by ECOWAS to lift sanctions on the countries where we've had military intervention, and particularly Nigeria taking the lead in announcing that all sanctions should be lifted? Does this amount to the humiliation of ECOWAS? And what does this mean for the democratic consolidation process within the West African region and Africa at large?
That's a great question to ask. And, I would like to say categorically that I think there are a lot of prospects in having the sanctions being lifted by the Economic Community of West African States, and in line with that, the Nigerian government too has also complied. I think it's worth the onions. So I would like to say that I think what the government has done right now, it's actually good. You know, it's good for ECOWAS as a regional bloc, and it's also good for the country. You know, we cannot remain in crisis. You know, irrespective of the odds, you know, that had happened over the last couple of months. I think the government has taken the right decision to lift the ban and the sanctions, you know, on Niger and Guinea. Now, you know, it is always said in international politics, in as much as you're preparing for war, also give room for peace. If peace fails, you go to war. And invariably, if peace succeeds, there's not going to be war. And so this is exactly what has happened. ECOWAS has taken the decision at the right time. You know, if you take into consideration all the crises in the last months that has engulfed the region. And so this is going to open up new vista for dialogue, negotiation, you know, and the way out. But I would also like to say it is not a victory for the Nigerian government. Neither is it a victory for ECOWAS. You know, and I would also say there's a stalemate. No. I think this will also give room for further discussion. You know, when two parties are fighting and there's no space for discussion, it creates more crisis. But right now, with the lifting of ban, it gives room for more negotiation, more diplomatic discussion that will actually create a perfect scenario for all the countries, especially the countries that are governed by the military, to come discuss with ECOWAS. And you know, for Nigeria, I would say it is very good because of our relationship with Niger. I know if you look at the Nigeria's foreign policy, the most important aspects of our relationship is with our immediate neighbor. You know, because the concentric circle takes into consideration the first part, you know, the first line of action, which is our immediate neighbor, followed by the West African region and African at large. And so it is very good for us that we keep a good relationship with our immediate neighbor. So I think that in all, I feel there are prospects and it's a win for all.
Well, I asked you about the democratic process. Won't people be emboldened to say, well, people stage a coup, nothing will happen. They will impose sanctions, they would leave these sanctions. Since there is a growth of illiberalism.
I wouldn't say, no, I don't think that is it. I think across the globe, even in Africa, we also realize that democratic government, the worst democratic government is even better than the best military regimes, you know. So I don't think, but I think with the sanctions that were already in place, as at the time the coup took place, it has actually sent a warning signal to all countries within the region, to all countries in Africa, that just like the framework, the OAU framework on unconstitutional government says, I mean, in terms of zero tolerance for unconstitutional government, so that has actually buttressed that point, the sanctions and all the embargo that was placed on these countries. So it has, I don't think it will actually truncate the democratic process in Africa, you know. And, you know, I want us to also take into consideration that in his inaugural speech, he talked about Nigeria going, the president now talked about Nigeria fighting for the sustenance and consolidation of democracy in Africa. And so I think the whole idea of governance, you know, we need to look at a whole lot of issues. Like I said earlier in one of our discussions, you know, that I think the important thing we have to take into consideration should be the root causes of unconstitutional change of government. And if we're able to address those issues, which I think, you know, with what has happened in the last couple of months, I think the African governments and even the regional government, I mean, I'm talking about countries in ECOWAS, will begin to look at those root causes that actually engendered military purchase in Africa. And so I don't think, like you asked, you know, if it is going to truncate the democratic processes in many countries, or it will also create a reversal of democracy. No, the warning has already been placed. The signals were there, and the impact of the sanctions were there. So no country will want to go back into that. And if you notice, after the last couple of months, a lot of countries are actually very careful in terms of reverting to military regimes again.
All right, Professor Ubi, I hear you, but I still think that in terms of the success of these sanctions and it being a deterrent, I still want you to expand on that a little. I say this because, yes, I hear you that the other state, you know, other member states would have seen that ECOWAS came in really tough on Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, imposing sanctions on them following military coups. However, how successful are sanctions if the sanctions are reversed without achieving the desired result? So the aim of the sanction was to pressure Niger to return to, you know, constitutional government. Unfortunately, this hasn't worked. Instead, in defiance of it, they made a move to exit ECOWAS. So how successful were the sanctions? In the same vein, as a member state, if they were going to, you know, explore the option of a coup, what they'd say is, okay, we'll put on the coup. Yes, we get an initial sanction. We're threatening to leave ECOWAS, and then they'll reverse the sanction. Would that not be the same mode? You know, would that not be the same mode? And that's why I find it quite difficult to understand how this would present or position ECOWAS in the light of we're against this and the sanctions have worked. That's one. The second aspect of this would be then, now that the sanctions are off, ECOWAS is still in pursuit of strengthening democracies in these countries. What are the options on the table? since they're not going the hard route, what are the other options? What would dialogue look like? And what is the what guarantees that this will be successful?
Well, I would like to put it this way. It depends on what you mean by success, in every action or inaction. Success depends on how you define it. For instance, when ECOWAS placed these sanctions on Niger and the other countries involved, you find out it affected them in a hard way. You see, if you understand the reaction by the three countries in the Sahel Alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, was as a result of the bite of that sanction. And in reaction, in anger, they decided to exit ECOWAS. But, I think a lot of international public persons have also stepped in. A lot of experts looked into the situation and realized that I think it is better to lift the sanctions and go back to negotiation. Now, the success of that sanction, let me put it, you see, the countries actually agreed. They were ready to talk in terms of the processes of returning back to democratic government. Let's take us back to history in the 60s and 70s and 80s. When military government or the military take over, you hardly hear them negotiating. But they were actually negotiating and they were ready. They were asking for, give us 1 year, give us 2 years, or give us 6 months. We'll do that, we'll return back to civilian rule. And I think that actually worked. It's just that the ECOWAS took it too hard on them by actually insisting on military intervention in Niger. Now, the reaction by the Sahelian country, I think this is something we also have to take into consideration, wasn't because of the sanctions per se, but because of the intervention brouhaha, where ECOWAS said they were going to send the military and they were going to invade Niger. And it is in that light that they even formed the Sahelian Alliance, that any intervention in any of those countries with military governments, then the three of them will come together, and actually revolve that intervention. So, generally speaking, sanctions have always worked. And sanctions have always given us a leeway for further discussions. Now, if you don't have to place sanctions a never-ending sanctions. Even sanctions could come to an end at a particular time when you see that there are results coming out. So I think for me, with the fact that they were even ready to talk, remember the last time before they formed the Sahelian Alliance was because Niger called for a meeting, and many ECOWAS countries really never went for that meeting. And aside that, even the one that went, those ones who didn't go actually gave reasons why they didn't go. And so that was when, that evening, that night, was when they now declared the Sahelian Alliance, So I think there are progress. I think, like I said, I often say there's no need for us to lay blames on any of the disputing parties. When there's crisis or there's conflict, we have to look at three factors in resolving conflict. You look at the stakes. You look at the disposition of the disputing parties. You also look at the tact in resolving conflict. See, if you have those access to those three factors and understand those three factors critically, there's going to be prospect towards resolving those conflicts or that conflict. And so now they look at the stakes involved in placing sanctions. ECOWAS now says, okay, let's take it off. Let's take off the sanctions. They also look at the disputing parties. The disputing parties now will be the states that are aggrieved, like the Sahelian Alliance states and the other member state of ECOWAS. They look at everything, find out that it is better to look for a different method, to resolve this conflict, which is the tact I'm talking about. So lifting of the sanction now give way for further negotiation, further talks, to see how the countries in military regimes will go back to the constitutional government. And I think we also have to give credibility to African governments and give credibility to ECOWAS for even taking the initial step to revolve military regimes in Africa. That is actually good. It has never happened before until much recently.
Okay, so a couple of things. Yes, it's never happened before, but there are many trends emerging. Number one is the Russian trend. In all these countries, they've got one thing in common. Wagner has a presence in Mali. And when we talk about the fact that they said they will give a timeline, Assimi Goïta has been given a timeline since God knows when. And Assimi Goïta is still stuck there after he got power. Nigerian authorities too, they are feeling comfortable in there. So when you talk about giving the timeline and all of that. So, and also invading is a no option because it's going to cause a lot of chaos. Have we thought about, number one, ECOWAS being a very dominant force by its capacity to use soft power? I say that because till date, ECOWAS does not even have an ECOWAS television or an ECOWAS coherent media arm that is well funded, that brings about its own, you want to use the word propaganda, and its own effect on these African countries. Secondly, is there a possibility of using the opposition in those countries? Because they are discordant tunes. In the case of Mali, in the case of Niger, there were very strong discordant tunes, you know, as regards, yes, people that might not have aligned with Bazoum, but people that were against the military onslaught. Is that a possibility ECOWAS could look at? Because that's the only option that's left on the table, because these other military forces that are taking over this country are bolstering by using Russian mercenaries. And Russia is in there for what they can take in the long run. And Africa is becoming another theater for Cold War, as it were, like it used to be in the 70s with Renamo and Frelimo. That's where Africa is again today.
Mr. Rufai, thank you very much. I think you've actually answered a little bit of the questions by even profiling solutions to the problems that Africa, ECOWAS, is facing. As a matter of fact, we all know right now that there is a superpower rivalry across the globe. And this is because of the emerging powers. Now, everybody is looking for a space. Within Africa, everybody is looking for a space within the developing world. And everybody is looking for a space where you have consistent, where you have abundant mineral resources. And so, like the Bible will say, in its place, let another take. When that happened, at the time it happened, the military pushes, the suspension of ECOWAS, the reneging of the Western powers against those countries with military regimes, other people had to move in. And now, you see, in international politics, you have to be very sensitive and very cautious, in any action or inaction you're taking. And that is why it is important for every government, right now, when I mean government, not just the government of Nigeria, but ECOWAS as a whole and Africa as a whole, to be, weary of what is happening. Yes, quite agreeable. We are going back to the period of the Cold War, but this is even much more different because there are new powers, and every power is struggling to maintain its dominant sphere. If you look at, during the period of the Cold War, the Europeans actually were the ones who were still in possession of Africa because they were, in quotes, the colonialists at the time. Then America moved towards Middle East to dominate, because I think it is speculated that whoever dominated the Middle East has power and influence. And Japan was allowed to dominate Asia and all that. Now China is here, Russia, that has, after the disintegration of the communist Soviet Union, Russia has also emerged as another power on its own, as a state. Now you're looking at India is there, and other Brazil and all the BRICS nation. Now if you also look globally, you find out that what we are talking about now is dispersion of power. And what they are looking for now is not just about military power, but economic power. And so everybody must be here. So if we place our discourse and pinpointedly refer to Russia, I think we are making a very big mistake, because the Western powers are still there. The US is still there, their bases are over there. So Russia coming into, Russia is looking for a space. I think what we need to do as Africans and as ECOWAS right now is also to discuss with these powers to allow Africans to settle their problems by themselves, and look at ways to settle these problems. I've just been talking about what is called preemptive peace and security approach. Preemptive peace means you forestall any crisis before it even shows, before it even becomes visible. You actually try to preempt, the future and try to put in place what can safeguard that future and, to avoid discord or crisis. And so this is what Africans should begin to do. But in terms of using the antagonists within the state, I think for us Africans, we wouldn't like that because Africa is already in chaos, and this chaos is not just the fact that the dominant powers are the ones coming in to create those discord or those crises. But even within the states, they use the other aggrieved parties to create discord. And so a lot of African nations, many, especially in West Africa and along the Sahelian region and routes, are already in discord. So I think we should begin to see how we Africans could take the bull by our horn to determine our future, determine our fate, and not to allow the external influence come in. That's what I think, And so, and like you talked about what can push for a power, give ECOWAS that dominant power in terms of propaganda. Well, that's why I said you have already answered the question. You have already suggested. I think this is the kind of thing we should begin to do. We should also create our own propaganda. Well, I wouldn't call it propaganda because whatever we are going to talk about Africa, it's about Africa and it's us. So it's not propaganda, but to make sure everybody understands the crisis in Africa. And like I've also argued, I keep arguing, is the fact that, you see, when superpowers come to Africa and they are talking about superpower competition, they are talking about superpower rivalry, it trivializes Africa. You make Africa look like a thing that can be kept on the table and divide among themselves. This is totally wrong. And this is something that I don't believe in. And this is something that no African should agree to. Let Africa dominate Africa. Let Africa manage their resources. Let Africa control their governance. And so we should begin to dissuade those arguments or propositions or positions or dispositions about the coming in of superpowers within Africa.
Okay, Professor Ubi, I get your point about the lifting of sanctions. And when you were quoting his place, let another take, I was going to ask, is Professor Ubi also among the prophets? Because you were quoting directly from the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 1, verse 20.
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not, but I think that it is.
Okay. But let's talk about ECOWAS. ECOWAS will be 50 years next year.
Okay.
2025.
Okay.
Now, it's facing quite a number of challenges. The one we're discussing, which is leadership deficit. The one that is not out there in the public domain, the competition among the groups, the French, the English, the Portuguese. The staffing and recruitment. They're going to have another recruitment process now at the ECOWAS Commission. The fear is that when the French are in charge of the ECOWAS Commission, the Secretariat, they take over every space to the disadvantage of the other partners, the Lusophone and the Anglophone. So there's this talk about reform of the ECOWAS Commission itself to make it more effective. What are those areas that you think, these reforms should be to realize the objectives of the original treaty setting up ECOWAS?
I wouldn't pinpointedly say this is the areas that could be reformed, but I think the documents should be looked into and they should bring in the experts, the technocrats to look at it. For instance, one area I will also ask that reforms should take place and is the fact that the issue of climate change and migration. I've asked that, you see, in the document, climate change and migration should be, the convention or the treaty that will be agreed on should be such that it will create innovation, it will create resilience, give room for innovations, give room for resilience, and give room for adaptation. You know, for instance, I propose that, you know, when it comes to migration resulting from climate change, if governments, individual governments could relocate, they can relocate population. Yes, I know that there are challenges because sometimes when you want to relocate the population from their ancestral land, they will refuse. But it is happening in other parts of the world. Now, issues like the places like the desert can also be used for recreation. We can stop the desertification. We can create buffer. We can create buffer to avoid desert encroachment. Those are some of the things. You know, for me, conventions, treaties, we have to move with the times. You don't have to allow a treaty, you know, that was put in place 40 years ago to remain the same. This is the 21st century. Even the crises, the conflicts we're having in the 21st century are all changing. Now, one of the areas too is the areas of governance, leadership and governance. I think we should sit down and look at, you know, the problems of governance in Africa. Do we have to define our own system, you know, that is based on our socio-structural dynamics, or do we have to adopt and adapt hook, line, and sinker the systems that are passed on to us? You know, these are issues that we have, because part of the crisis in Africa and crisis in ECOWAS, even the resultant of the change of government, you know, unconstitutional change of government, is the leadership crisis. You know, because over the years we've had sit-type presidents, we've had a permanent president, and this is uncalled for. So we have to look at now even the areas of sanctions and in trying to prevent military purchase or military regimes. We also have to look at that. How do we prevent future military regimes? How do we prevent future military purchase? Now, do we have to retrain our militaries again? You know, I think these are all the issues we should look at. Then, importantly, ECOWAS should look for a way, you know, within its protocols or convention to see how we can relate with the advanced powers, the Western powers, and see to it that that relationship does not undermine governments in Africa. You know, there are a lot of areas. I can't pinpointedly tell you that this is that, you know, but in terms of economic, the whole essence of ECOWAS was to build an integrated economy. In short, in fact, ECOWAS was supposed to transcendentally move from economic integration to political integration. And with all these crises we are having, you know, it is going to take a long time for us to get to that political integration. But if we are consistent with astute policies, reforms, you know, and put in place the right institutions, put in place the right structures, we can get there. So for me, you know, basically it's about the will and commitments of governments of African states, but precisely with ECOWAS in mind, right?
All right, thank you so much for sharing your optimism about the future of ECOWAS with us this morning, and of course, strengthening democracies across the region. Professor Efem Obi.